Minchio Kim is the undisputed sovereign of the Seoul underworld, a man whose lethal calm is as cold as the steel he uses to keep order. He built his multi-billion-dollar empire on the rejection of human connection, operating under the absolute belief that power is the only armor that doesn't rust. But even the strongest armor has a seam. Within the first few moments of tonight's high-speed journey, that armor is stripped away. His most trusted colleague, Han-Sol Park, has traded loyalty for silent ambition, orchestrating a break-line perishment that sends Mio's life careening into a dark, forgotten ravine. This mechanical betrayal triggers an absolute status collapse. The man who once looked down on the city from glass towers is now a vulnerable giant, lying bloodied and amnesiac in the mud. His impeccable three-piece suit soaked in sewer water and oil. His life now hangs on the intervention of a total stranger, Zora Williams. A black female mechanic with oil-streaked skin and a wrench held like a weapon, Zora finds him where the city stops looking. As her flashlight beam cuts through the driving rain to land on Mio's matted hair and glazed eyes, she looks horrified, but her jaw is set with a lethal calm. She is the only one who knows how to fix what the world has broken. While Zora pulls the shattered icon into the safety of her grease-stained garage, the architects of his downfall are already celebrating. High above the neon-soaked skyline, the atmosphere in a private luxury lounge is thick with the icy malice of a successful coup. Han-Sol Park stands silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, his dark turtleneck swallowing the light. He swirls an amber whiskey, a predatory smile tugging at his lips. In the quiet of the room, he thinks of the wire cutters and the clean, clinical cut he ordered, a sabotage designed to look like a simple failure under stress. He turns to his associates, his eyes twinkling with the smugness of a man who believes he has finally outmaneuvered a giant, unaware that a nobody in coveralls has just become the most dangerous variable in his plan. The rain didn't fall over the winding mountain pass. It descended like a heavy, suffocating curtain of liquid iron. Minchio Kim sat in the rear of the armored sedan, the lethal calm of his expression mirrored in the dark, rain-streaked glass. He was a man who moved through the world as if it were a game of chess he had already won. His impeccable charcoal suit a shield against the chaos of the streets. But beneath the floorboards, the clinical sabotage Han-Sol Park had orchestrated was already beginning its work. As the car banked into a sharp, descending curve overlooking the ravine, Minchio felt the first tremor of a failure he couldn't calculate. The driver's foot pressed the brake, but there was no resistance, only the hollow, sickening brake-line perishment that Han-Sol had designed to look like a mechanical tragedy. For a heartbeat, the status collapse began before the metal even touched the guardrail. The speedometer climbed, the engine roared against the lack of friction, and Minchio's chilling gray eyes met the driver's in the rearview mirror. He saw the reflection of a man who realized he was already dead. The impact was a symphony of screaming steel and shattering glass. The sedan didn't just crash. It took flight, a multi-ton predator turned into a falling stone. The world became a kaleidoscope of shades of gray, and violent flashes of light as the car tumbled down the steep embankment, shedding its luxury like dead skin. The airbag deployed with a sound like a gunshot, and Minchio felt the amnesia begin to fracture his mind even as his body was tossed like a rag doll inside the velvet-lined cage. When the car finally came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, it was a mangled skeleton of its former glory. Minchio crawled from the wreckage, his fingers clawing at the sour trash and mud that lined the stream bed. The billionaire who had rejected everyone was gone. In his place was a ghost in the mud, his designer blazer shredded, his face a map of blood and road grit. He collapsed into the silt, the cold water of the ravine soaking into his skin, his pulse a frantic, fading rhythm. The icy malice of the mountain air began to pull the warmth from his bones. He looked up at the road far above, where the flickering lights of the city he once owned seemed like distant, unreachable stars. He tried to remember his name, his empire, or the face of the man who had done this to him, but there was only a vast, terrifying, calculating quiet in his head. As his eyes began to glaze over, the shattered icon, realized that in this ravine, power didn't bargain and wealth couldn't buy breath. He was just a body in the dark, waiting for the rain to bury him, until a sudden sharp beam of a flashlight cut through the downpour, heralding the arrival of the only variable Hansol hadn't accounted for. The flash of the lightning was the only thing that gave the ravine a shape, a jagged strobe light revealing the skeletal remains of the luxury sedan twisted around a weeping willow. Zora Williams scrambled down the embankment, her heavy boots sliding through the treacherous, oil-slicked silt. The grit and grease of her garage felt miles away, replaced by the raw, metallic scent of an ending. Her flashlight beam, a shaky finger of light, cut through the downpour until it caught a glint of chrome, and then the shattered icon himself. Minchio Kim lay half-submerged in the rising runoff, his impeccable charcoal suit now a sodden, tattered rag. Zora's breath hitched, a sudden spike of primal desperation hitting her chest. She had spent her life fixing engines, understanding the predictable physics of pistons and valves, but the sight of a human being in such a state of status collapse was a different kind of wreckage. He looked like a vulnerable giant, his pale skin ghost white against the black mud. His once ferocious eyes now rolled back sightless. "Hey! Can you hear me?" Zora shouted over the rhythmic roar of the rain. She dropped to her knees beside him, the cold water soaking through her heavy-duty coveralls. She didn't reach for a medical kit. She reached for the heavy metallic wrench tucked into her belt, using it to pry a piece of jagged door frame away from his pinned shoulder. The metal groaned, a sound of structural failure that echoed the break-line perishment she hadn't yet discovered. Her face was a map of horror but determination. Every instinct told her to run, to call the authorities and retreat into her ghostly invisibility. But as she pressed two fingers to the side of his neck and felt the faint, erratic thrum of a pulse, the lethal calm that made her the best mechanic in the district took over. She couldn't leave a man to be buried by the silt, even if he was a monster from the glass towers. "Stay with me, Minchio," she whispered, the name feeling heavy and dangerous in her mouth. She hooked her arms under his, the delivery bag strap-like pressure of his weight straining her muscles. With a grunt of pure, agonizing effort, she began to haul the shattered icon upward, away from the rising water. The climb back up the ravine was a slow-motion nightmare of sliding mud and gasping breaths. Every time her footing failed, she looked at the blood on his forehead and the amnesia, already clouding his features, and she dug her nails into the earth. She finally reached her rusted tow truck at the top of the ridge. Panting, her lungs burning with the icy malice of the night air, she bundled him into the passenger seat. As she climbed into the driver's side, her hands, slick with oil and his blood, gripped the steering wheel. She glanced at the wreckage below one last time. She didn't know about Hansol Park's predatory smile, or the shadow behind the curtain, currently celebrating in a penthouse. She only knew that she had pulled a dying star out of the mud, and as she shifted the truck into gear, Zora realized that her life of counting bolts and hiding from the world had just gone up in flames. The rescue was complete, but the anatomy of a lie was just beginning to unfurl. The heavy, corrugated metal door of the garage groaned as it slid shut, sealing out the relentless Chicago rain and leaving Zora in a world of grit and grease. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone, burnt rubber, and the metallic tang of blood. Minchio Kim lay in the small, makeshift living quarters above the shop, drifting in the slow-burn tension of a fevered sleep, while below, his shattered vehicle sat like a hollowed-out beast under the harsh hum of the fluorescent shop lights. Zora didn't go to sleep. Her waitress's eye, the hypervigilance of a woman who had spent a lifetime noticing the things others ignored, wouldn't let her. She moved to the wreckage of the sedan, her dirt-streaked hands reaching for a hydraulic jack. She needed to know why a billion-dollar piece of engineering had failed so spectacularly on a routine mountain pass. As the car rose, the shadows beneath the chassis stretched long and jagged, revealing the shades of gray of the undercarriage. She slid onto the creeper, pushing herself deep into the belly of the machine. At first, it looked like a standard high-speed catastrophe. The suspension was twisted, and the radiator was a mangled accordion of aluminum. But then her flashlight beam, a sharp, unwavering finger of light, landed on the rear brake assembly. She froze. The hydraulic line hadn't burst under the pressure of the crash. It hadn't been frayed by road debris or worn down by time. She reached up, her fingers tracing the edge of the rubber casing. The cut was perfect. It was a clean, diagonal slice made with the icy malice of a surgical strike. This wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a brake line parachment, executed by someone who knew exactly how much fluid would need to leak out before the pedal went soft on a sharp turn. Zora felt a cold spike of primal desperation hit her chest. In her world, things broke because they were old or because they were pushed too hard. In Minchio's world, things were broken by design. She realized then that the vulnerable giant, sleeping upstairs, wasn't just a victim of a ghastly accident. He was the target of a professional execution, and by pulling him from that ravine, she had inadvertently stepped into the line of fire. She slid out from under the car, her breathing shallow and ragged. She looked at her workbench, where her father's old tools lay in a neat, disciplined row. She had always prided herself on being able to fix anything, but as she stared at the severed line, she realized this was a lie she couldn't repair. The anatomy of a lie was laid bare before her, a conspiracy of silent ambition that reached from the glass towers of Seoul down into the grease-stained floors of her sanctuary. Zora walked over to the industrial sink, scrubbing the oil and road grit from her hands until the skin was raw. She looked at her reflection in the spotted mirror, seeing a nobody, who was now holding the most dangerous secret in the city. Above her, she heard the rhythmic creak of the floorboards as Minchio shifted in his sleep. His amnesia, still a thick veil between him and the men who wanted him dead. She knew then that the hospital noose of her mother's bills was no longer her only threat. Hansol Park's predatory smile was somewhere out there in the dark, and Zora Williams was the only variable left in his way. The rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe in the corner of the garage was the only sound in the calculating quiet of the pre-dawn hours. Zora sat at her scarred wooden desk, the harsh light of a single desk lamp casting long skeletal shadows across the grease-stained floor. In her hand was a thick white envelope, the hospital noose, that tightened around her neck a little more with every passing month. She pulled out the statement for her mother's cardiac care, the numbers printed in a cold, indifferent font that seemed to mock her primal desperation. The total was a mountain she couldn't climb, a staggering sum that made the grit and grease of her daily labor feel like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. If she didn't make a significant payment by the end of the week, the facility would move her mother to a state ward, a transition they both knew would be a death sentence. Zora looked toward the stairs leading to the loft where Minchio Kim lay. He was a vulnerable giant, a man whose signature on a single check could erase her life's worth of debt without he blinking. But as an amnesiac, he didn't even know his own name, let alone the power he held over her future. To use him, to find a way into his accounts while he was helpless, was a paper gamble she wasn't sure her soul could survive. Yet, the pressure of her mother's survival was a lethal calm that pushed her toward the unthinkable. She stood up, her movements heavy with wide-eyed exhaustion. She walked to the window, watching the rain wash the grime of the city into the gutters. Somewhere out there, Hansol Park was likely sitting in a lounge, drinking expensive whiskey and celebrating a brake line parachment he thought was final. He had the money, the power, and the icy malice to win. Zora only had a wrench, a dying man, and a mounting pile of debt that felt more like a cage than a life. A soft groan from upstairs shattered the silence. Zora moved toward the loft, her waitress's eyes scanning for any sign of intruders in the shadows of the garage. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw Minchio struggling to sit up, his chilling pale gray eyes wide with a mix of confusion and a flickering raw terror. He looked at her, not as the billionaire who had rejected everyone, but as a man searching for a single anchor in a sea of amnesia. I don't know where I am," he rasped, his voice a dry, hollow echo of the man he used to be. Zora felt the weight of the envelope in her pocket, a physical reminder of the choice she had to make. She could turn him in for a reward, she could exploit his silence, or she could protect the shattered icon from the wolves that had sent him into the ravine. As she reached out to steady him, her grease-stained hand looked dark against the white of his bandages. The hospital noose was still there, pulling tighter, but as she looked into his eyes, Zora realized that her primal desperation had found a new, dangerous focus. She wasn't just saving a man. She was guarding the only variable that could break her mother's chains, and she would hold the line until the calculating quiet was finally broken by the sound of the enemy at the door. The shadows of the garage loft were deep and suffocating, smelling of old iron and the sharp, clinical sting of the antiseptic Zora had scavenged from her meager supplies. Minchio Kim lay beneath a moth-eaten wool blanket, his chest rising and falling in a ragged, uneven rhythm that betrayed the status collapse of his once invincible body. When his eyes finally flickered open, they didn't hold the lethal calm of the billionaire who had built an empire on ruthlessness. Instead, they were wide, fractured, and filled with the primal desperation of a man who had lost his own soul. He tried to sit up, but the movement sent a lightning bolt of agony through his ribs, forcing a guttural groan from his throat. He looked at his hands, pale, trembling, and devoid of the gold signet ring that Hansol Park had likely already replaced in his mind. He was a vulnerable giant, in a world that had suddenly become oversized and incomprehensible. The memory of the break-line perishment was gone, replaced by a terrifying hollow silence that felt like a noose tightening around his identity. Zora appeared at the top of the stairs, her silhouette framed by the dim orange glow of a single shop light. She still wore her grease-stained coveralls, her wide-eyed exhaustion mirrored in the way she carried a bowl of warm broth. To Minchio, she wasn't a nobody mechanic or a variable in a corporate coup. She was the only pillar of reality in a world of shades of gray. "Easy," she said, her voice a low thread of lethal calm that seemed to steady the air in the room. "You've got a concussion that could kill a horse. If you keep moving like that, you'll open those stitches." Minchio looked at her, his chilling gray eyes searching her face with a calculating doubt that quickly dissolved into raw vulnerability. Who am I?" he rasped. The question was a status collapse in its purest form, the king of Seoul's underworld reduced to a child asking for his name. Zora hesitated. She thought of the hospital noose in her pocket and the news report she had seen on her phone, images of a man named Minchio Kim who was described as a shark and a monster. She looked at the man before her, shivering under a cheap blanket in a garage that smelled of oil, and she couldn't reconcile the two. "I don't know," she lied, the words feeling like grit and grease in her throat. "I found you in a ravine. You were just a body in the mud." He slumped back against the pillows, the weight of his amnesia visible in the slump of his shoulders. The man who had rejected everyone now reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against Zora's rough, calloused palm. It was a save the cat moment in reverse, the predator seeking warmth from the prey. "Don't leave," he whispered, the command replaced by a plea. Zora felt the slow burn tension of the secret she was keeping. Somewhere across the city, Hansol Park was likely celebrating his victory, unaware that the wolf was still breathing in a grease pit. She looked at Minchio, this vulnerable giant who had lost everything but his life, and she felt a sudden, fierce determination. She was no longer just a mechanic fixing a broken machine. She was the keeper of a shattered icon. As she sat on the edge of the cot and guided the spoon to his lips, she realized that the anatomy of a lie was now the only thing keeping them both alive. The king had fallen, but in the calculating quiet of her garage, Zora Williams was beginning to build a new kind of power. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the corrugated metal roof was suddenly punctuated by a sound that made Zora's heart seize in her chest. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the garage's service door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a neighbor or the hurried knock of a delivery driver. It was a heavy, official sound that carried the weight of the law. Zora looked up at the loft. Minchio was awake, his chilling pale gray eyes wide with a sudden instinctive alarm. He didn't know who he was, but his body remembered how to react to a threat. She pressed a finger to her lips, a silent command for him to remain in the calculating quiet of the shadows, and then she descended the stairs, her leather soles echoing like a countdown on the concrete. She slid the heavy bolt back and cracked the door. Standing in the shades of gray of the misty alley was Detective Miller. He was a man made of sharp angles and deep creases, his trench coat darkened by the rain and his eyes holding the cruel joy of a hunter who had found a fresh scent. "Late night for repairs, Williams," Miller said, his voice a gravelly drone that didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped past her into the garage, his waitress's eye for detail immediately scanning the room. Zora wiped her grease-stained hands on a rag, her lethal calm, a thin mask over the primal desperation blooming in her gut. "Cars don't break on a schedule, Detective. What brings you to this part of the district?" Miller didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the center of the shop, his gaze landing on the mangled sedan. He circled it slowly, like a predator inspecting a carcass. He stopped at the rear, his gloved hand reaching out to touch the area where Zora had discovered the clinical sabotage. "Funny thing," Miller murmured, his back to her. "We found a high-end sports car in a ravine 3 miles from here. Total wreck. But the driver, one Minchio Kim, is missing. No body, no blood trail leading out of the woods. Just a lot of expensive scrap metal." He turned, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Zora's. "And here you are, the best mechanic in the zip code, with a high-end wreck on your lift that looks remarkably similar." The status collapse of her safety was nearly complete. Zora felt the hospital noose of her mother's bills tightening, the secret of the vulnerable giant upstairs becoming a lead weight. "I buy scrap for parts, Miller. You know that. This isn't Kim's car. It's a salvage job from the north side." Miller leaned against her workbench, his elbow inches away from the white hospital envelope. He picked up a pair of wire cutters, turning them over in his hand. "Hansol Park is making a lot of noise at the precinct. He's worried about his colleague. He's offering a reward that could pay off a lot of medical debt, Zora. A lot of debt." The slow burn tension in the room was palpable. Above them a floorboard creaked, a tiny infinitesimal sound, but in the silence of the garage it sounded like a gunshot. Miller's head snapped toward the loft. His hand moved instinctively toward his holster, his expression shifting into calculating doubt. "You got someone up there, Williams." "Stray," Zora said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "Just a stray I pulled out of the rain. You want to audit my guests now, or do you want to talk about the brake line perishment that no one at the precinct seems to want to investigate?" Miller froze, the mention of the sabotage catching him off guard. For a heartbeat, the icy malice of the conspiracy flickered in his eyes, a sign that he knew more than he was letting on. He dropped the wire cutters back onto the bench with a sharp clack. "Keep your head down, Zora," Miller whispered, his voice losing its official edge. "This city is full of shades of gray, and people who go looking for the light usually end up in the dark." He turned and walked back into the rain without another word. Zora waited until the sound of his car faded before she collapsed against the sedan, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked up at the loft where the shattered icon was watching her from the dark. The detective's knock had been a warning. The shadow behind the curtain was closing in, and the anatomy of a lie was no longer just a secret, it was a death warrant. The penthouse lounge was a cathedral of icy malice, where the only sound was the rhythmic, crystalline clink of ice against the side of a heavy crystal tumbler. Hansol Park stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the neon veins of Seoul pulse beneath a veil of freezing rain. He had expected a phone call by now, a confirmation from the morgue or a report from a recovery team detailing the retrieval of a shattered icon. Instead, there was only the calculating quiet of a city that refused to give up its dead. He turned away from the glass, his dark designer turtleneck making him look like a shadow that had detached itself from the wall. His predatory smile had thinned into a line of calculating doubt. He had audited every hospital within 50 miles, used his iron grip on the local precincts to monitor every Jane and Joe Doe, And yet, Minchio Kim had vanished as if he were nothing more than the ghost in the mud Han Sol had intended him to be. "People don't just evaporate, detective," Han Sol murmured into his phone. His voice a low, dangerous vibration. Detective Miller's report had been vague, filled with shades of gray about salvage yards and North Side wrecks, but Han Sol had a waitress's eye for the small details. He knew about the woman in the grease-stained coveralls. He knew about the small, independent garage that sat like a rusted tooth on the edge of the industrial district. An hour later, a sleek, black SUV drifted to a silent stop in the shadows of the alley across from Zora's shop. Han Sol didn't step out. He sat in the darkened interior, watching the flickering orange glow of the shop's single fluorescent light through the rain-streaked windshield. He watched the way the grounded hero moved behind the corrugated metal door, the quick, efficient shadows of a woman who was fixing more than just engines. He saw her emerge to drag a heavy bin of scrap to the curb, her wide-eyed exhaustion visible even from a distance. But it was the way she looked back at the loft before she went back inside, a lingering, protective glance that confirmed his suspicions. The vulnerable giant was in there. The shark had found a reef to hide in, and the nobody mechanic was the only thing standing between Han Sol and the absolute finality of his coup. A cruel joy began to bloom in Han Sol's chest. He didn't need to rush. He would play this like a paper gamble, watching the garage until the primal desperation broke Zora Williams, or until he could catch the wolf while his claws were still blunted by amnesia. He picked up a pair of high-powered binoculars, focusing on the upstairs window where a moth-eaten curtain twitched. The anatomy of a lie was collapsing. Han Sol realized that the hospital noose he had discovered in Zora's files was the perfect lever. He wouldn't kill her yet. He would let the weight of her own life crush her until she handed him the shattered icon on a silver tray. As the SUV's engine hummed with a suppressed power, Han Sol leaned back into the leather, the calculating quiet of the alley now his greatest weapon. He was no longer just a colleague. He was the shadow at her door, the shadow behind the curtain that was about to turn her sanctuary into a tomb. The calculating quiet of the alley was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden violent death of the garage's overhead lights. Zora froze in the center of the shop, a heavy industrial wrench still clutched in her grease-stained hand. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the metal roof intensified, sounding like 1,000 frantic heartbeats. Through the high, grime-streaked windows, she saw the silhouette of a sleek, black SUV idling at the curb, its headlights extinguished like a predator closing its eyes. "Mio, get down," Zora hissed, her voice a flat thread of lethal calm. Above her, the floorboards of the loft groaned as the vulnerable giant shifted. He didn't have his memory, but the primal desperation in his movements told her he understood the geometry of a hit. Zora didn't wait for him to respond. She moved with the fluid, practiced the efficiency of a woman who knew every inch of her sanctuary, heading straight for the hydraulic lift control. A sudden, sharp clink of metal against glass echoed from the rear service door. They weren't coming through the front. Han Sol Park's professionals were auditing the perimeter, looking for the anatomy of a lie Zora had built. She realized then that she couldn't outrun them, and her hospital noose made it impossible to simply surrender. She had to use the grit and grease of her world to survive theirs. "In the pit," she whispered as Minchio scrambled down the stairs, his chilling pale gray eyes wide with a mix of terror and a flickering dormant rage. She pointed to the open grease pit beneath the mangled sedan. "Stay below the line. Don't breathe until I tell you." As Minchio lowered himself into the dark, oil-slicked trench, the service door was kicked inward with the force of a status collapse. 3 men in dark, tactical gear spilled into the shop, their movements synchronized and silent. They didn't use flashlights. They moved by the rhythmic strobe of the red neon sign from the bar across the street. Zora slid into the driver's seat of a heavy tow truck parked near the entrance. She didn't turn on the engine. Instead, she reached for the remote winch control. As the lead hitter approached the grease pit, his weapon raised, Zora triggered the release. A massive suspended engine block, held up by a rusted chain she'd intentionally weakened, swung violently through the air. The sound was a sickening thud of iron against bone. The lead hitter was swept off his feet, his icy malice replaced by a guttural cry as he was slammed into a stack of tires. Zora didn't stop. She slammed her foot onto the tow truck's air horn, a deafening discordant blast that shattered the calculating quiet and blinded the intruder's auditory senses. In the chaos, she grabbed a canister of pressurized degreaser and sprayed it across the floor in a wide, slick arc. The second hitter, rushing toward the tow truck, lost his footing on the grit and grease, his leather soles sliding helplessly as he crashed into a heavy tool chest. Zora lunged from the truck, not with a gun, but with the heavy wrench. She swung with the primal desperation of a daughter fighting for her mother's life, catching the third man in the solar plexus before he could level his suppressed handgun. The air left his lungs in a ragged wheeze, and he buckled, falling onto the oil-slicked concrete. She stood over them, her chest heaving, her face a map of horror but determination. The grease pit hideout had held, but the shadow behind the curtain was still out there. She looked down at Mincio, who was climbing out of the pit, a strange, dark clarity beginning to return to his gaze. The amnesia was thin, and the wolf was starting to wake up. "We can't stay here," Zora rasped, looking at the black SUV still waiting in the rain. "The noose just broke, Mio. If we want to live, we have to stop being the prey." She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing the white hospital envelope, and for the first time she wasn't counting quarters. She was counting seconds. The siege was over, but the lion's signal was about to be sent. The black SUV tore through the rain-slicked streets toward the heart of Seoul, but the man in the passenger seat was no longer the vulnerable giant who had hidden in a grease pit. Mincio Kim sat with his back pressed against the leather, his chilling pale gray eyes fixed on the passing neon blur. The amnesia had finally shattered, not with a whisper, but with the violent clarity of the garage siege. Every betrayal, every break-line perishment, and every face in the shadow behind the curtain had snapped into place. Beside him, Zora gripped the steering wheel, her grease-stained coveralls a stark contrast to the lethal calm now radiating from the man she had saved. "You don't have to do this, Zora," Mincio said, his voice returning to the deep, dark vibration of a king. "The hospital noose is already being cut. My loyalists have been signaled. You can walk away." Zora didn't look at him. Her wide-eyed exhaustion had hardened into a final, fierce determination. "I started this repair, Mincio. I'm going to see the engine run." They arrived at the grand gala of the Kim Empire, a glass and steel fortress where the city's elite gathered to celebrate Honsol Park's coronation. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with icy malice, and the smell of expensive champagne. Honsol stood at the mahogany podium, his designer blazer a shroud for his silent ambition. He raised a crystal glass, a predatory smile etched onto his face as he prepared to announce the unfortunate passing of his colleague. Mincio Kim was a man of power, Honsol began, his voice a smooth, cultured drone. "But power is fragile. In his absence, we must look to." The massive oak doors of the ballroom slammed open, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the calculating quiet of the room. The shattered icon stepped into the light. Mincio was not in a tuxedo. He was still in the blood-stained charcoal suit from the ravine, his face scarred and his presence a physical weight that seemed to crush the oxygen from the room. Beside him stood Zora, the grounded hero in her work clothes, a living testament to the world he had survived. The status collapse was instantaneous. Honsol's glass shattered on the floor, the amber liquid splashing like a premonition of his own break-line perishment. The elite gasped, a wave of shock and urgency, rippling through the crowd as the lion's signal was finally felt. "The report of my death was a paper gamble you shouldn't have played, Honsol," Mincio said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He didn't rush. He walked toward the stage with the lethal calm of a predator returning to his territory. "You audited my life and found a ghost. But you forgot that ghosts can haunt. As security teams, Loyalists who had been waiting for this exact moment moved in to restrain Han Solo. The shocking twist was not just Mio's return. It was the way he turned to Zora. He didn't offer her a reward or a bribe. He offered her his hand. The cold, ruthless Mafia boss had died in that ravine, and in his place stood a man who finally understood that power was nothing without a soul worth protecting. He led the mechanic to the center of the stage, ignoring the flashes of the cameras. The anatomy of a lie had been exposed, and the hospital noose was gone forever. In the wreckage of his old life, he had found something far more precious than a billion-dollar legacy. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, a silent promise made in the middle of his greatest victory. The king had returned to his throne, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't sitting on it alone. Zora had saved his life, but together, they had saved the city from the dark.